de tener a Sonya Dyakova. Supongo que ya conocéis todos, pero bueno, es un trayecto profesional muy interesante. Ella nació en Rusia, en Siberia, de allí luego de muy jovencita se fue a San Francisco, allí se educó como diseñadora gráfica, luego cambió de lugar a Londres, donde estuvo trabajando primero en diferentes estudios, en Frost Design, luego en Pierre Nobel, y de ahí pasó a estar un tiempo en Pheidon como Design Director, donde realizó muchos libros. Esa parte de la razón que esté aquí, porque sabéis que estáis en el posgrado ahora de diseño editorial y uno de los proyectos que hacéis es el diseño del libro. Y a partir de ahí, gracias a unas revistas también que hace para Frieze, es como empezó ya su práctica profesional y individual, y supongo que estáis al corriente de todos los proyectos interesantes que hace. Pues nada, le damos la bienvenida y que ya seguimos con su charla. Gracias por venir.
Hello. Thank you for having me here. It's a pleasure to be in Barcelona, and well, I will try to keep it simple, and I'm not sure exactly what you're interested to know, and I encourage a lot of questions afterwards so that it can be as useful as possible, this lecture. And if you would like to ask a question, just do, and don't be shy. Yeah, I can tell you about myself and my practice, and I don't have a lot of sort of philosophies or big statements. I can tell you what I try to do every day in my work, and a bit where I come from, and hopefully that will be somehow of use. So there's one thing I found that really, I think, summarizes what I feel about graphic design in my view. Is a quote by Bruno Munari. He says, "To complicate is simple. To simplify is complicated. In order to complicate, you just need to add something, whatever you wish, colors, shapes, actions, decorations, characters, environments, full of odds and ends. Everybody is able to complicate. Only a few can simplify. And I think it's such a difficult thing to do, and I'm not saying that I've got the answer how to do it, but I try. With every project that I do, I try to simplify, and I try to find the essence of what is at the heart of the subject matter. So I suppose the philosophy I would promote is to research your subject and to find clues in the subject itself. So if it's an artist or a business or whatever it is, find the most important and the most essential elements that are about this artist or business. To try to express these essential elements through the tools that you know. So typography, color, material, binding techniques, printing techniques, everything that you've learned, try to use it to communicate all these essential points. And the last one is the most important, I think, is to see it to the end. So if you start with this idea, you have to complete it to the very end, and that's how you get a story. You can't just start and then kind of go off in the middle and be influenced by maybe things that look nice, but they actually are not relevant to the project. So therefore you will end up with, behind each decision that you make, you will have a reason for doing things the way you've done it. And that makes it easier actually to explain to your client or people you're working with why you have come up with this decision, because you will be challenged many times, and people will try to say, no, I like blue, I don't like red. And if you don't have a good reason for choosing that color, it will be more difficult to end up with a project that you really, really wanted in the first place. So, for example, the Bruno Munari's dictionary of gestures, supplement to the Italian dictionary, is an example of how he strips down to the very simple elements. So each one of these pages has one photograph of a gesture and maybe only a few lines of text explaining the reason for this gesture. This is where I come from. It's in the middle of Siberia. It's not too north, but it was pretty cold. And I lived there until I was 14 years old, and at some point, this is where the kind of house we lived in, this is actually looking onto another building from our balcony. But there were zillions of these buildings all around Soviet Union, and everybody had the same kind of apartment because it was built as a kind of standardized system of living. So it was pretty grim, as you can see. And this is my city. It's very industrial and very ugly, in fact. But I had a lot of fun there growing up, and we left in 1989, just when Gorbachev was in power, and he opened the doors to a lot of people to immigrate, and we went here. It's quite a contrast. When my mother said that we're going to immigrate to San Francisco, I said that she was making a big mistake. But now I can see that she didn't, because if she made a mistake, I wouldn't be here and I wouldn't be doing what I want to do. So in San Francisco, I have studied in high school, then in college. It was a mixture of education. I went to a Jewish high school, and then I went to a Catholic college after that. So I was taught by both rabbis and nuns. And then attached to this, the Catholic college had an interesting program where you could attend an art college at the same time to get your art degree. So I thought that was quite a good combination of rounded education. So I had academical and art education. And another part of the reason why I went there is because I was accepted there. And the state college, the nearest college to me, they didn't have a graphic design program. So my mother spent a lot of money paying for this college. So after I studied, and it was in the last year of my studies, I started to get interested in what's going on in Britain in terms of design. And my friend called Precious, she said to me, why don't we go to London? I have a friend there and we can sleep on her sofa and, it'll be fun. So I said, yeah, let's do it, let's go. And basically, she was going just for fun and she didn't have any agenda to stay there. But I, at that point, thought that it would be really interesting to actually try to get some work there. So I prepared my portfolio. It wasn't complete in any way, but I just put some things in the box and I made some appointments to see some people. And that was good, and everybody was friendly, but I understood that it was not enough to visit and just say, yes, maybe I'm interested, but you had to move there and really make a commitment to, if someone said, yes, can you start tomorrow, you would say, yes, I can. So I've done that. I moved. I got a visa for 6 months, a working visa, which allowed me to work anywhere I wanted. And I came. And I went to see different studios almost every day in different parts of town, this was before we had mobile phones, so I had to call up everyone from a phone booth, and it was hell. But I found a job at Frost Design as an intern. So that was kind of a dream job, really. And I think it was so good that I felt a little bit that it was unreal. And at a certain point, I think I lost the focus to how good it is and what could it be for me and what it could do for me. And I sort of, I got distracted. I wanted to go traveling with my friends in Europe, and so actually it ended. My visa came to an end after 6 months, and I didn't know what to do, so I went home. And already on the flight back home, I realized that I made a mistake. So when I came home, I wrote back to Vince Frost and I said, please take me back. It was a big mistake. And he was very nice about it, and he, of course, things in the studio change, and it was a very small studio. At the moment, he has a huge studio in Sydney, or Melbourne, is it Sydney? Sydney. But back then, it was only 3 people, 4 at most. So what I did was I made friends with people in the studio, and I used to come, and during a year, I used to go back and visit them, and I used to just visit the studio, and eventually he said, yes, we can arrange a visa and we can get you back. So that's how I came back to London. But why I'm showing this tomato book, this was the book that initially got me interested in London in the first place. And I had this dream of, I'm going to go to London, I'm going to work for Tomato. That was my ambition. I did go visit them, but I didn't get a job there. And in the end, I think it worked out really well. So just to backtrack, how I went to see people in London, I would send them something first. So I made this book by hand. I bound it, and it was hardbound book with embossed lettering on the front. And it was all about how I enjoyed London and how I found a lot of energy in the city, and it was inspiring. And I would send it to people that I really, really wanted to work with. And I think they just found it difficult to throw it away because it was a nice object. So that was my trick, to send something and then to follow up with a call and to try to see them. So after working at Frost Design for a couple of years, and then I worked at Chernobyl, like Mark mentioned, which was an amazing lesson in itself. I got paid very little, and they had clients that all were art-based clients, museums, or there were small art or cultural organizations that just couldn't afford to pay me a lot. But I managed to last there for also a couple of years. But what I learned there was pretty much the foundations that I could then use in the next move. And the next move was Pheidon Press. Someone recommended me for the job of design manager. And at the interview, they asked me whether I ever managed anyone, and I made up something, and I said that yes, I did, and I absolutely did not know what managing was all about. And my job at first was, actually the whole time I was there, it was more or less the same, but I just had more and more trust from the publisher to do what I wanted. But the job of design manager was to be a link between the publisher and the editors and the designers that were designing the books. And as a kind of perk or plus, you could also design titles for the publisher alongside it. And the trick was really, how do you divide your time between, are you really a manager or a designer yourself, or can you do both? And I always wished that I could just design and not manage, but that was the job, and that's what paid. So I tried my best, and one of the most interesting things about the job was that I got to work with Alan Fletcher, and that was a real attraction for me. So this was my desk at Pheidon, and I must say that upstairs where the editors were, there was, it wasn't like that. It was little desks, you know, hardly any light, and I had a view on the canal, and it was lots of space for me. And I think that was quite representative of how Pheidon valued design. And I never again came across a publisher where they don't let their marketing department lead, but they let the design and editorial lead. So that's, I think, is something interesting, where the publisher with the designer and with the editor decide the book that they want to make, and then they call up the marketing person and say, this is what you have to now go and sell. So this is very different to what I think happens to in many other publishing houses, where the marketing department is at the very beginning involved and has a say in, you know, what color he thinks sells, or what should it be called, or, you know, there was none of that at Pheidon. And I think design was really valued, and that's why this was a great place for me to work, because I had a lot of rights as a designer. This was one of the things that was just on my wall there. Cheered me up. So when I was at Pheidon, I suddenly realized that, you know, I was making books that would be printed 5,000, 10,000 copies. And imagine how much paper and ink and effort that is, and how much money that is. So if you're going to do something that's going to be multiplied that many times, it's better be good. And I think this fear of making something bad and then sending it all over the world kind of really pushed me. So the first book that I designed for Pheidon was a huge 800-page book about Araki, who's a Japanese photographer, one of the most controversial figures in Japanese photography. He's a kind of a baddie. His work is very erotic, and he's also very funny, so he has this persona. Anyway, when it was one of the first design meetings that I had with the publisher, and the question, they asked me who should design this book, and I said I should design this book. So I think the point is, if you don't ask, you don't get. You just have to say what you want to say. What do you want? And they said, okay, do it. They probably thought, let her try it, and if it's bad, we can get someone else to do it. And so I had this massive responsibility of making this 800-page book. And when I started to read about Araki and his own writings, so this book, the reason why it was so different from all the other books is that it actually featured writings of his own about his work, about his family, about his mother and father, and about his cat. And when I was reading these texts, I realized that he's really actually a nice guy. You know, he has all these pictures of women that he hangs and ties. You know, they're wearing kimonos, and it's all quite sexy. And he plays this kind of goofy guy, but actually he's a very sincere person. So what I wanted to do is I wanted to play on this contrast of a kind of rogue character and then this very actually pure character. And that's why, for example, I used Bodoni, a very classic and elegant typeface. The cover, for example, has this material that feels like skin, because there's a lot of nudity in his work, and it's quite sensual to touch. And there are a lot of details in this book, tactile details that cost publisher a lot of money to produce, but there are sort of varnishes and a lot of tip-ins, and it was a complete nightmare for production department to produce, honestly. So that's Araki. And so I felt that the texts should be separate to the pictures, and they should be almost like a little stage for the words to be separate to his photographs. And that's why I used these color pages that were inset into the photographs. There were 3 sections dividers, and so there were a lot of different different feels to paper, different things going on typographically. But photographs were never messed around with, and they were always just really used large. Sometimes I think there were little sort of grids, because he produces a lot of work. But this is his typical work. Not all books that I designed at Pheidon I wanted to design, and they sometimes just landed in my lap. And if they went first to one designer, and then actually the concept was rejected, they would say, "Okay, Sonya, you have to design it now." And sometimes I didn't fancy it, but I had to do it, or at least I had to have a go. So that's how Sculpture Today happened. So they said, "Oh, do this book about sculpture," and I thought, "Oh, sculpture, what do I really know about sculpture?" And I started to research about, or think about what is sculpture. There are so many different materials you could use for sculpture, and the only thing that unifies this idea of sculpture is that it's a 3-dimensional object. And to choose one material over another would be wrong, because it would not be representative of the subject. This book was about many different artists, and it was about sculpture in the last 30 years. So I couldn't single out one particular material or an artist. So that was a kind of beginning of a solution that I came up with, where the thing that I know is how to work with paper as a graphic designer, and typography. So by making typography 3-dimensional, you sort of answer the brief. So I made this typeface called Paper Alphabet. I'm not the first one to make one, and there are many similar ones out there with many variations. But that was my solution, and it was a very laborious process. Once the editor saw what I was making, she said, "Yes, that's good. I think you should complete it and present it." And in the end, we made, I think there were 18 chapters, and we made lots and lots of these paper sculptures. I had someone to help me because I couldn't do it by myself in time. And then the rest with images, there was not a complicated formula. There was just using images as large as possible, because what you're really showing is the artwork. So each chapter divider had a paper sculpture. So all of these paper sculptures had to be photographed. My husband photographed it at our home, and we live in a 1-bedroom apartment. He blacked out the whole thing, and it became a studio, and it was a complete nightmare, but we did it. So for example, to illustrate the idea of seeing things to the end, this is a chapter divider for the end matter, the index. And I thought, how can I reuse this idea again and not give up until the end? So these are this is a piece of paper that was left after I made the paper alphabet. So it's kind of en matter idea. And inside the index, all the letters are still made of paper. And this is under the jacket. This book is about Lewis Carroll, who is everyone knows him as the author of Alice in Wonderland, but he's also a photographer, and he took famous pictures of the children in the area that he lived in England. So he's from Victorian times, and he's not only a writer but also a mathematician, and he loved word play and puzzles, and he had quite a surreal approach to words, and he played with them. So I thought it was appropriate for the cover of this book. This was a collection of 55 photographs, to take lines out of his one of his books, Alice, not the Alice in Wonderland, but Alice in Looking Glass, I think it's called. I thought it was a nice metaphor for looking glass as a camera. And I pulled out letters that made up his name, somewhat similar to what he does in kind of puzzles and word games. That's him on the back cover. And I tried to bring in, another dimension, not just show photographs, but show familiar things that we know about him. So this is a little thing from Alice in Wonderland. And the typeface that I used is just a found type from Victorian era. And I used a lot of Victorian sort of decorations, but not too much. And one of the things that I found out about how he kept his albums, he had many albums of photographs, and he would ask the sitter to sign their name under the photo. And I thought it would be a lovely thing to do to kind of create a feel of an album. And that's why, for example, the edges of the pages are cropped off to make it look authentic. And I love using all of the space available for expressing your idea. So under the jacket, there's also a space that can be discovered. So for example, this was under the jacket, and it featured another quote from Alice in Wonderland, which was foil blocked into the material. Younger Than Jesus was a fun book to do. The publisher has, when they briefed me, they said, this is a directory. Maybe I should start from the beginning. There was an exhibition at New Museum in Manhattan called Younger Than Jesus, and the New Museum has collaborated with the publisher to create a kind of directory of 500 artists that are all under age of 33. So when I heard the word directory, that immediately meant to me it must look like a directory. And so I found a hook in that, and I decided to make it look like yellow pages. Yellow pages on acid, kind of my own interpretation of yellow pages. So I tried to find all the clues that I could use to how do you make it look like yellow pages. So one thing to do is to use a typeface that is originally been used for AT&T books, these directory books, telephone books. And this typeface was designed by Matthew Carter, especially for AT&T. And it's brilliant because it's very space-saving, and you can fit a lot of words on the page. That was the whole function of it. The second thing I used was paper. So the paper is very, it's kind of throwaway paper. It's very light. It's you can see through it. It's not a good quality paper, and that's how you stay true to the subject matter, what you're trying to say. And this way, I was able to fit a lot of artwork into pages using this kind of grid, very compact. When you open, for example, advertising section of telephone directory, you see lots and lots of things. And the last kind of thing that my interpretation of it, I added different letters of the alphabet in different styles, just to communicate the diversity of different artists from all over the world in this book. And all the names of the artists are outside, so it's easy to find on the front cover and back. This book was a complete nightmare from a point of view of trying to get an idea, and it got rejected 3 times. I will give you the background of this project. So Premia is a kind of series of books that Pheidon did, where they would ask 10 curators to name 10 most promising young artists, and together it would be a kind of compendium of who is who and who is up and coming in the art world. And I think this book was used a lot by art buyers, and years from then these people became famous, and so it was a very successful series of books. But when it came to me, it was a real challenge because they already made 4 of them, and the formula was the same. You ask 10 curators, you get 10 artists, So it was really difficult to think outside the box of how to, what can I add fresh to this series? What can I do next? And so I think the name of it really thrown me. I thought it was a silly name, and I thought about sort of using inks that had flavor, smell, or try to play on this idea of, at some point I think I was making a book look like a cake, and it was just ridiculous. So all these ideas were rejected, and I was very frustrated. And I actually said at one point, who wants to buy this book anyway? It's £49, and nowadays you can get this information online or buy a magazine. So that actually gave me some ideas how to move forward, because if the book was not bound and thick, maybe it doesn't have to be £49, maybe it could be cheaper. And the final idea, sort of how it all came together, I thought that if there's all these important people saying that these artists are new and up and coming and they deserve attention, it's sort of like making news in the art world. And so what is making news? It's a newspaper. So why don't we make a kind of a big newspaper with unbound sheets, and then it doesn't have to be so expensive. It can be £25, and you can print more of them and sell more. And so once this idea came into place, then everything else was easy. And I modeled this book on FT, Financial Times newspaper, and this was during recession, so it sort of actually was very relevant to model it on that. So the color came from that, and the format was very large format, and that allowed me to use images really large, which is brilliant for artists. And in the book you couldn't do that. So everything, the column grid and the type, it all sort of followed from that idea. I didn't have to try hard anymore. I mean, I tried hard, but it wasn't so laborious anymore. It came easily. And this was the idea for how to sell the book. Yeah, that book, it got me Grand Prix at Tokyo Type Directors Club, which I wasn't expecting at all, but that's a very nice thing to have. So the publisher was publishing a lot of art books, that's what they specialize in, but at some point they published a cookbook, and they realized that it sells a lot of copies. So they decided, we're going to make cookbooks as well. And the first one I think they did was Italian cookbook, Silver Spoon. Then the second one was a Spanish one, 1080 recipes by Simone Ortega, or Inés Ortega and Simone Ortega, which was illustrated by Javier Mariscal, which was very nice. And so the next one was, let's do a French cookbook, and we have to have a French illustrator. So I started looking for all kinds of French illustrators, and finally found someone called Blex Bolex, who is inspired by people like Jacques Tati and Cassandre, and just fitted really well into this, into the subject matter. So that was a very important decision to make, to commission him. And the book was actually written in 1932, a long time ago, by a woman called Jeanette Mathieu. And since then, they reprint and they modernize the recipes, but it's essentially her book from the 30s. And because his style is very retro, it was a good fit, I thought. So it's a very thick book. Another design decision was to print the book on uncoated paper, which is very unusual for cookbooks. Normally they're coated and I guess protected for the oil spills and so on, but we thought it was more important that the book felt lovely and not so heavy, because coated paper is much heavier than uncoated paper. And also, I think it's a very brave move to use illustration on the cover. If you look at most cookbooks in the shops, you will have either an image of a food or a celebrity chef. So I think Pheidon has started this tradition of not doing that, and they're continuing with it very well. So I did quite a few cookbooks while at Pheidon, but always working with an illustrator, and this is a really great thing to do. And I learned a lot from working with illustrators and how to commission them and how to also work with them to get what you want. I've learned that you should never be prescriptive when you brief an illustrator, and that way you can get an unexpected result, not exactly what you maybe imagined, but probably better than what you imagined. So, for example, Jeff Fisher did this cover and some of the illustrations inside, and I never said to him, draw tomatoes on the cover. I just said, this is an Italian cookbook, and it's about summer recipes. So he went away, and he came up with this, for example, which I think is brilliant. So it's a journey, a kind of map, culinary map that looks like from Renaissance. The photographs were by Joel Meyerowitz, who's a kind of, he's an artist, which I think is amazing to use in a cookbook. So it gives you kind of a flavor of the place as well as the recipes. Similar story with Tuscany. The illustrator comes up with an idea for a cover. You never tell him what to do. Typography here, for example, was influenced by the street signs in Italy, just very classic. This was one of the last books I did for Pheidon. It's about Ronan and Erwin Borolek. They are furniture designers in Paris. They're brothers. They're originally from Brittany, and they grew up on a farm in a kind of a farmhouse. And I think their childhood was filled with kind of functional objects, not very fussy, and they are very known for their tactile abilities. Everything that they do is very minimal, but it has humor, and it's very beautiful things that they make. So I went to see them in the studio, and I wasn't sure what I was going to find, but I think it's really important, if you can, always go to the subject's studio or where they work, if they're alive, or just do as much research as possible, because you just don't know what you're gonna find and what clues you will dig out. So I went there, and he showed me around, and what I noticed was that there were stacks and stacks of Moleskine notebooks that they draw every day, both brothers, systematically. And I thought, this is really beautiful. Their drawings are really beautiful, and I think I have to make a feature of them. So it's not just about the furniture, the finished piece, but about the drawings that they make. So, for example, that's how the idea of chapter dividers came up, and we used kind of Moleskine-like paper that was slightly smaller than the page with the drawing on it. And then we played around, showing a lot of drawings inside, alongside the objects. And that made the whole book richer, and made you understand as a reader much more about what they make, or how they come up with these objects. No one really wants to look at a catalogue of furniture. That's boring. So at some point, I was very happy at Pheidon, but I think I got to a point where I wanted something else, and maybe do still books, but for other people as well, not just for Pheidon. And at the same time, I had a child, and so it gave me some time to think about what I wanted to do next. And it's a kind of classic, what happens to women. You rethink your moves, and but luckily, towards the end of my maternity leave, I got an email from one of the women from Chernobyl, Frith, who said, they're looking to redesign. What does that say? It's gonna blow up in 5 minutes. It's okay?
Yeah.
Okay.
It stops automatically.
Oh, okay, because I didn't, okay. So they said they're looking for someone to redesign the magazine at Frieze, and do you want to do it? I said, of course I want to do it. And it's actually 5 minutes from my house, so that's perfect. So I went there, and at the interview they asked me if I like contemporary art and if I follow it, and I said, yes, I like it, but I actually really like 20th century art better. And I like people like Picasso and stuff, Modigliani. But they didn't seem to mind that I said that, and they hired me anyway. And I think maybe part of the reason why they hired me is, for example, the book that I did, Premia, where I was able to present artists in a good way, to be able to edit their work and to show them in a good light. So I first had to work with an existing design to get used to it and to get used to the content. So this was one of the covers I did with existing typeface and so on. And then I got to redesign the whole thing from scratch. So Frieze, it's a kind of tricky thing. There's you as a designer, but then there's the editor or editors who know very much about the subject, who's who in contemporary art, who's hot, who's not. And what you think looks good doesn't necessarily mean it's right. But at the same time, you want it to look good. So we constantly have this kind of push and pull thing, but I've learned to, you just basically have to talk to the editors and get the best out of the material that you have. So a lot of times it will be actually difficult when, how do you show video art, or that's just always looks terrible in print, and you have to make the most of what you have, and maybe things that don't look so good, somehow you have tricks to how to show it in a different way. Maybe don't make them so big. So I introduced a kind of I gave myself some freedom in terms of typography, and I said, instead of just using one typeface, why don't we have two typefaces, and we can use not just one weight of it, but we can use all the different ways. So you could use light to bold, or you can use, oh my God, accidents. It's fine. So you can use many different sizes. You can use, you can do whatever you want with these typefaces, but they have to be these two typefaces. And recently I also said, okay, why don't we also have sometimes a guest typeface? It's a bit like in a comedy sitcom, you have a guest appearance. So sometimes you have a completely different typeface. Then part of it is just to keep things fresh, but it still then feels like a family. So there's a lot of variation going on. There was a lot of also discussion about paper, and I really wanted to be on uncoated paper, the whole thing, but they said, advertisers don't like that, and they're going to all leave us, so, let's keep it on a matte paper. So we had a compromise, but I managed to convince them to have the back section of the reviews on uncoated paper, so everyone is happy now. I mean, it is still a kind of a commercial magazine, so it's not... So here's an example of using a guest typeface. It's nothing to do with the typefaces that we use normally, but it is very much to do with the subject matter. And things that I looked at when I redesigned the magazine, for example, is how nice it is to be able to have a large image and then maybe lots of text, but separate them and don't have to have lots of text and images mixed together, and white space. I think that's just kind of essential things about this magazine. So this is an example of the review section on a different paper stock. And on top of this, I also am involved in doing other graphic things for them, occasional sort of advertising, and like this is an advertising for a writer's prize, or I do campaigns for them. I mean, it's something that I don't do often, but it's fun. And it also can look nice. And things like greetings for Christmas. So at some point I said to Freeze, this is really great, and I think the magazine is in a good shape, and I would really like to now do more, try to get my own clients and not work for you all the time. So they said, okay, I have an assistant who helps me, so I don't have to be there every day. And it was really risky thing to do, because you sort of say, okay, I'm going to work less and hope that some other clients come to me, but they might not come. So I did a lot of, I emailed, I think, at least 10 people every day with this kind of email saying, I'm expanding my practice, this is what I've done so far, and just basically asking for work in a very sophisticated way, but basically that's what it was. And one of the people I emailed, you know, you email and then most people don't answer and you never hear back. But one of the people I emailed was Cartier Foundation. Just found the email on the website of the person to email, and I actually had an answer. And they said, yes, we're going to be in London next week. Would you like to meet with us? And I said, yes, I would like to meet with you. And they had an artist that they were doing a catalogue for, a monograph, and he's based in London, so it sort of made sense to work with a London-based designer. And this was Ron Mueck, who is a, you know, very, I don't know, his shows are very popular, I think, because of the work that he does. They're, you know, they're very realistic. I don't know if you know his work, I will show you in a second. It's kind of hyper-realistic sculptures made meticulously, you know, that they look very real. So one of the things I did at first is I looked at all the other books on Ron Mueck, and I saw that they all use kind of serif typeface, you know, very feminine. And I thought that the figures themselves, they already look very, you know, curvy and irregular. So I would like to use something really heavy and very geometric as a contrast to that. So that was the choice behind the type. That's brown from Linetto. And we had a lot of discussion about the cover. I actually wanted to blind emboss one of the figures or a detail of a figure on the cover using white paper, and in the end it just all fell through because they said we can't have a white cover that's not laminated, and I said I'm not going to have laminated cover. So basically it was very expensive to produce, and I had to quickly think of another solution. Otherwise they would have used a photograph, which was not what I wanted to do at all. The book is full of photographs, so why have another photograph on the cover? That's boring. So I found a paper that had a kind of texture of kind of hair or skin. It could be like skin or hair, either works for this subject matter, because, you know, all you see is skin and hair in his work. And inside there were two different paper stocks. One of them is called Skin, and it actually feels very skin-like. So that's again connected to the idea of these nude figures. So this is typical of his work and his most recent work. And these are giant. So another thing about his work, one of the most essential ones, is that he plays with scale. So he has either giant people or tiny people. And what I try to do with typography is use either large text or small text, nothing in between. And another detail that I pulled out was to use his sketches interleaved between the work, so that you can see the sketch next to the actual work, but they wouldn't be on the same paper. It would be a kind of a different level. So all of these like nails and hair, each one had to be inserted by hand, and he has assistants, and they just work quietly while listening to the radio. So all of this development has actually, all the clients that I really wanted and, you know, wished for, they started to come to me. I think probably all that emailing and or luck, I don't know how, but so through emailing, I found I saw a Russian name in the gallery, Max Wigram, and I thought, oh, I'm gonna email her and say I'm Russian too. So we met, and at the time she didn't have any projects to do, but she remembered me, and then later on she called me and she said, oh, I'm doing this project. We're going to have a wall around a car park in South Kensington that we can use for putting artwork. And we're gonna have Stefan Bruggeman, a Mexican artist based in London. He's gonna put his text pieces on there, and we need a catalog. So this is them installing the work, and we want to make it in a form of a newspaper. So it's kind of just cheap, and we can just give it away. And because it's the wall, I thought, okay, so they needed a logo, but they also, so I had identity for the whole wall project, and then they needed to have the publication. And this was the time when I decided, okay, now I need an intern. But she was from ICAL, from Switzerland, and she was gonna come like 1st of April, but I needed to start the project earlier. So I just told her, look, I think it's a good idea to use Stanley typeface, which is designed by Ludwig Belland, and it's a revival of the Times typeface, which is the newspaper type. Makes sense. So why don't you try it and just print it out and put it around the wall, around the corner, and see what happens. So she did many tests, and she emailed it to me, and that's how we came up with this, the wall identity. And then working on the cover, I've asked her to come up with different ways of, you know, if you were thinking about this wall and structures and urban planning, urban environment, what could we do? So she came up with many different ways of doing his name in different kind of structural shapes, and this was a kind of wall that she built out of type. And so then it followed inside. We, you know, used it as quite brutalist, kind of urban, big type. And then works. And the sad thing is that the residents of South Kensington, which were, they said that this was not art, and this was advertising, and that they wanted to take it down immediately. So there was a huge hoo-ha about it, and I think they closed it. But the curator, who my contact at this project, she said, "This is brilliant. You know, this is the best thing that could ever happen because it has publicity." And she said, "I'm going to be famous." So, and I continued to keep in touch with Pheidon, and there was one book that I did with them, which was a lot of work actually, but it was nice thing to do. It's for an artist, Edmond Deval. He's a potter, and he makes these millions and millions of pots that he arranges on shelves. And the thing about him is that he uses different colors of white. So sometimes it's like bluish white, sometimes more like beige white, but it's all white. And he's very kind of minimalist in his practice. So this book cover actually was not materialized. This is what I was proposing, and instead we did this, which was a cloth that was embossed and printed at the same time. It's something I've never done before, but now I know it works. That you can, if you emboss and print a tint on this on the fabric, it can kind of make it look a little bit more real or embossed. Get a better relief. So the inside we used a lot of different white paper with different shades. So some were creamy, some had it was Bible paper, some that were more coated. And typography-wise, I try to arrange my typography a little bit like he does with his pots. Very minimal. I think I proposed something more sort of expressive, and he just said, no. I think it's really about the art and not, he didn't want to be upstaged, I guess, by typography, which is fair enough. So the typography is very simple. So it's very typical of his work. He makes his vitrines with pots inside. It's beautiful. Some of the texts were on Bible paper, printed in color. Another book that I did actually was a contact from someone who used to work at Pheidon as a photography editor. She also moved on, and she now works at Aperture New York. And I also emailed her, and I said, how are you? I'm looking for projects. And she said, that's perfect, because I have this book called Open Road. And the book is about photography and the American road trip through different periods of time. So starting with, Robert Frank to contemporary photographers. And it's all about getting in the car and going across America and taking pictures. Kind of a celebration of American road trip. So how did I research the project? I started looking at maps, and I love the kind of graphic language of these maps. They're so crude and kind of very basic looking, but the colors are fantastic. And I tried to make my own version of that, but trying hard not to overstep the line of, where do you stop being decorative and how do you, it has to be contemporary as well. So using kind of this several typefaces, very reminiscent of the language, graphic language of these maps, but then leaving the rest very simple. So just using color and type. William Eggleston, Lee Friedlander. So sometimes you have to stop yourself going nuts over typefaces, and knowing when to stop is good. Frieze also started to do a new art fair, not just for contemporary art, but for art that is older. And instead of doing a catalogue that they do every year, they said they will do a magazine. And they asked me to design it. And actually this was perfect because, as I said before, I actually much prefer that kind of stuff anyway. And so the whole idea of the fair is to not just to present, artworks from, and they range from like medieval times to 20th century, but to look at this art through the lens of contemporary art. So kind of combining contemporary art and the art that was made before year 2000. And this idea of looking through gave solution to the cover. So each cover has this die-cut opening, and you see something through it. It's printed on uncoated paper all the way through. My wish came true. So sometimes you don't know, you can't see the whole thing. Don't know what it is, but when you open it, then you see the whole work. And when thinking about the typography, what can I do with typography in this magazine? If this is Frieze, it's called Frieze Masters. Who is the master of type? It's Helvetica, of course. you know. So I found it was recently released then. Haas Grotesque is like the original cut of the new version, kind of a digitalized version of the Helvetica. So what I didn't realize that through different versions and digitalizing in the beginning Helvetica, it wasn't actually the first Helvetica, and this is. So I thought this is perfect fitting, you know, the master is here. And I looked for inspiration at artist magazines from the 60s, where they, you know, it was large format, and I guess large format is good for art. You know, you can really see things. And I like, it's satisfying to play with the opening spreads, because you can use type in many different ways. You know, you're not obliged to use it in any size. That, you know, you can do what you like as long as you use that type. That's fine. Then there's this whole talk about apps and digital. You know, are books dying, and magazines, and someone out of the blue that I didn't actually know called me up and said, "Oh, I want to do this magazine on an app." And I should have really checked this guy's background, but in the end, he was an idiot, because he just ran away with this project and he never paid me for it. And I tried for a long time to get my money, but I only got half, basically. Anyway, it doesn't matter. This was my attempt to do an app. I mean, we do an app at Freeze magazine anyway. So that was my first experience, and this is just done kind of outside of Freeze. But basically I wanted to show it to you because I just wanted to say that whatever the medium is, whether it's printed or digital, it shouldn't change really the way that you think about design, and the whole exercise of trying to get to the essence is still the same. I don't think you should sway from that. It's just more fun, I guess, to play and with different things, and that things can move. You can make animation, you can make type move, so that's a plus. But you can you can apply the same principles to digital, just the same. This book just arrived at my desk last week. This is the second project with Cartier Foundation, and again after the Ron Mueck, I just went to visit them, and I said, I would like another project, please. And they said, okay, we have a Bruce Nauman show coming up, and we also have a show about Congo. And I said, oh, I don't want to do a book about Congo, that sounds too heavy. Very, very serious subject. But Bruce Nauman, I would like to do. So this is a show that is on right now. I think it's until the end of June, or maybe 21st of June. And it's an artist that I didn't really know very much about, but I knew that he has a big position in contemporary art, in conceptual art, and he is someone who likes to provoke and disturb the viewer, and he uses many different ways of doing that. He uses his own body, he uses video, he makes prints. He makes installations. He doesn't have one thing that he does many things. And he uses sound as well. So part of the show was sound pieces, which is one of these. And you can see that there's hardly anything in the room, it's just sound. And this is one of the installations downstairs called Carousel. So basically we had to research and understand about Bruce Nauman and what he's about. That's him. And one of the things that we found was that he loves playing with words and letters, and like here, for example, swapping words around and playing with that. So I looked at his name. It's very kind of interesting how it's almost like his work, his artwork. And so it became clear that there was some connection actually with his own name. So he does things like this. Or he also overlaps things. So this idea of hiding something and abstracting something, making it not clear. So it's quite disturbing. So I also had that in mind, that we should overlap something, somehow do that. So that was in the end, that's the back cover. And that's the front cover. So we overlap his name with a picture, slightly hiding it, and we do this now man. A lot of his sound pieces are about kind of chanting or repetition. There's a lot of repetition in his work. And because he does not only digital work, but also he makes drawings, he makes prints, looking at the type, we found a typeface that is sort of a combination of digital pixels and a drawn line. So that actually made a lot of sense to use that. So each, I don't know if you can see here, but I should have brought the book really along with me, but each chapter we decided to make a different size, and because he doesn't have one way of doing things, we wanted to express that idea of having different levels. It doesn't all just fit into one box nicely. They're all different. And so all these sections were bound together. So we had to find a way to do his sound pieces, just very kind of typographic. Some of his drawings and sketches and installation photographs. And that's when he was younger, a very dashing man. So far I've been showing you kind of art books, and that's most of the kind of projects that I worked on. But one day I was in touch with a gallery called Hauser & Wirth, which is a big gallery. That they have a gallery in New York and in Los Angeles and Zurich. We were talking about doing a book, but at the same time someone else called me from Hauser & Wirth, and they said, I'm a restaurateur. I have restaurants, and I'm going Hauser & Wirth are opening another gallery in the middle of a field in Somerset, in countryside, and they would like to have a restaurant inside this gallery. So I'm going to open a restaurant there, and I would like you to do an identity for it. And, I'm not a branding person, but I know how to make a logo. So I said, yes, I'm very interested. So they've built this amazing, basically the location for the gallery is on an old farm that they renovated. And the owners of the gallery actually live down the road. They live in this countryside. And this is the environment that they really love. They have animals, they love farms. And this is what it looks like now. And when we went there, it was all still being built and, completely construction site. They modernized the farm. They have an amazing garden. And so they talked about their vision of the restaurant, that it was going to have lots of art inside, and it just was difficult to imagine what they were, how it would be. And I thought at first that, if you have a gallery full of art, do you really want to have art as well in a restaurant? That sounds weird. But anyway, I didn't disagree. And this, the idea of the restaurant was that it was going to be a kind of replica of an installation by Dieter Roth, and the restaurant is called Roth Bar and Grill. So Dieter Roth is a German artist who works a lot with food, actually, making things out of chocolate and spices and using food as a medium for his art. And he also kept a lot of diaries. So we went away thinking a lot about the countryside and woodland creatures and animals, and they were going to have a lot of meat in the restaurant, and presented a lot of ideas that had to do with that. But and one of the ideas also looked at not showing any sort of animals or but being just more kind of type was kind of almost made out of wood, and in the end it really made sense if you look at the beams on the top in the ceiling that really sort of connected with this typeface. But in the end, it really had to be more about Dieter Roth and than any of these surroundings. And so that's the route that was chosen. And this typeface is called Separat, and luckily it just looks very kind of as if it was made of wood by hand. Quite awkward in some letters, like the B and the G and the R. They're quite handmade. And for the menu, we just made a replica of one of his diaries that had this pig on it, and because they really, the restaurant is all about using local farm animals, and so this really was a good idea to use. And inside, instead of having one long list of things that are on the menu, we created this kind of different ways of looking and finding something that you would like to eat, kind of boxes instead of a long list. This is a poster we did for them. It was a Friday night late, so kind of the logo dancing. They had a DJ and everything, and some postcards, and a website. So it's interesting to dabble in different projects, and not to say, oh, I only do books and I don't do branding. Actually, you can do it all. You can do it all. I think these are. I'm almost there, almost done. Gagosian Gallery also called, and I was happy about that. They are a great gallery to work with, and they publish a lot of books, so it's good to work with someone who really knows the process of publishing a book. And they were doing it's a small book. I think they wanted to test me out on a small book, and it's Michael Craig Martin is a contemporary artist who makes his art sort of is all about everyday objects, very pop colors, and he was invited into Chatsworth House, which is a kind of mansion in the middle of a countryside in England, to do something. So he had his sculptures placed in the garden around the house, and also he did an intervention inside the house, which I'll show you. So when we started working on it, these were the ideas, the essential ideas about him that were in our mind. And typography-wise, we were inspired by sort of IKEA leaflets that you get for instruction, like how to put your shelf together. It's that kind of language of everyday objects that we were looking for. So the type actually doesn't, express very much, because the objects themselves, they're full on enough. We commissioned an artist to create a map of the grounds, and you can see where the artworks are placed. And this is his works in Chatsworth House. So if you can see, the colors of his works are very, it's very kind of neon bright, and we use different papers that were inset into the book. They were pre-dyed papers. And that's the intervention that he's done inside the house, where he placed these classical sculptures on very bright pink neon blocks. Guestbook magazine is a little magazine, a quarterly magazine that I've just redesigned in just over Christmas for a company called One Fine Stay. It's a little bit like Airbnb, but really expensive. You can stay in really amazing houses and pay a lot of money for it. And when you go to one of these houses, you will find on the coffee table a magazine, a guestbook magazine, and it's all about sort of traveling and being at home in a different neighborhood, or sort of, I guess the whole idea of staying in someone's home is that you become a local very quickly, and you can check out the local cafes and what's going on in the area. So they kind of wanted to redesign their magazine, but also they had this dilemma of how do we show the homes that you can stay, how basically can you advertise your houses and still have this editorial feel. And at some point they were together in one magazine, and they decided to separate them. But then one looked quite different to the other one, and they had no connection. So the challenge was they asked me to propose something that could work together. So this is the solution that I came up with. You have two magazines, they are the same format, but maybe the paper is different. So the guest book is on uncoated paper, and homes can be on a very coated paper, since it's advertising. So let's not deny it. And it could work as a system. So one of the things that they already started doing, and they did quite well, is to use illustration. And I said, you shouldn't get rid of that, you should keep that, but just make it better. And so we kept with this idea of illustration for the guest book. And this is the first issue that just came out maybe a month ago. So it's this issue is called Adventure Issue, and it's about finding adventures in everyday, simple things. So just going past the florist shop can be a kind of adventure. This is a illustration by Daniel Frost, a British illustrator. And a nice idea that the editor had was to divide the magazine in 3 sections and call them by a kind of room name. So you have the front room, salon, and backyard. And we wanted to find a way to use patterns to kind of break things up in terms of visually break them up. And we've used wallpaper, in this case by Eli Kishimoto, to kind of have these little breaks. So they're using illustrators, and the way that we are working together is that I'm not, I've redesigned this first issue and I had a lot of my hand in this magazine, but in the future there is a designer who works in-house, and we work together. So I don't do every single thing, but they also collaborate. We're collaborating together. So the second issue, I think, is happening in June or so, and we will see. But the nice thing is that I'm able to suggest contributors to them, and some of the things or people that I admire, they never heard about. So I said, do you know about Myra Kalman? She's amazing. They didn't know about her, so they then contacted her, and here's an extract from her, one of her books that they placed in the magazine. And I think for me it's very satisfying to work in that way, collaboratively, and to suggest things, suggest illustrators, and then let them get on with it. Thank you very much. I hope it was okay.
Thank you. ¿Hay alguien que quiera hacerle alguna pregunta a Sonia?
Hi. Yeah, okay. I see that you have a huge source of illustrators and you collaborate a lot. Do you actually have people come to you, or
Yeah.
are you the one that always takes names out of your illustration bank?
It's both. It's a lot of people contact me, and it's actually quite a lot to look through, and you never know what you're gonna get, so you have to make a note of the people that you like, and but it's both. So you have to also actively search for new people, and there's so many out there, and it takes a lot of time actually.
Yeah.
If you go to It's Nice That and you start looking, my God, it can take days. It's like a black hole. But you know, there's some really great talent out there, and a lot of young people, and that's nice to kind of work with either. But yeah, it's both.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
¿Alguien más quiere preguntar?
Hi.
Hi.
At Pheidon, how much time did you have? Did they give you to design the books?
I think it's
More or less.
It varied depending on the schedule and where it was, you know, what has actually happened before. So it could be that there's so many factors involved, you know, sometimes it takes things slow down because of different factors, and then it's at the, you know, by the time that they say to you, you need to design it, you have to do it now, like right now. You have one weekend to come up with a concept, and then you're like, well, you know, can I really do it? And then you realize, yeah, you can do it. But it's not brilliant way to rush, but sometimes pressure is good. And sometimes you have lots of time, but as you know, designers or any creative person procrastinates a lot. And you can take, if you have a month, you will take the month, and you have 2 months, and you will take 2 months. So I think it really varied. Normally, I would say 3 weeks was a good time that we would give to designers to come up with a concept. 2-3 weeks. And then, of course, the book itself takes much longer. But the idea, that's how much you would give.
Thank you.
Sure.
Hi.
Hi.
Being as a graphic designer, you think like, if I just want to focus in editorial design,
Yeah.
from young people that it's starting, you think that it's better to focus just on that, or to be open to, as you said, creating logos, branding, and everything?
Oh, it's difficult. I think, yeah, to a certain degree, you have to be open to opportunities that come to you. And sometimes I believe that when things come to you, you should really listen.
Yes.
But at the same time, I would also say you should only do what you really want to do. So if you know, it's good to be focused, because what can happen if you are too relaxed about it, you can say, oh, maybe I do this or maybe I do that. I mean, this only happens like I'm now gonna be 40. So this kind of detours into different areas, they only come to me after people see that I can do I have a lot of projects. But I would suggest as a beginner to only just go for what you want.
Yeah.
Because what happens is that you get used to things and then you might go off. Or maybe it's not about the thing that you do, but what the ideals that you have, and just try to stick to that. So even if it's slightly different to what you imagine, the setup, but if the ideals are the same and if you have the same language with the people that you are working with, then that's good. And then that means that you can grow, but never go to a place where you think you just try it for the sake of trying it, and if you don't think it's a good place.
Okay.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think so. Because it's hard. I mean, you have to learn about everything,
Yeah.
but you have to focus on something. So maybe you just have to
Focus?
reject
Yeah.
something just because you are so focused on that, and maybe that could be confusing.
Yeah, but I think also a lot of job opportunities, they not only that you reject them, but they might reject you for the right reason.
Yeah.
Like I went to many interviews, and went to many branding places, and they kind of looked at me and said, well, maybe you are not really will fit here because your work is not about that.
Okay.
And I'm glad that they said that, because they did me a favor and they kind of pushed me to in the channel that I was going anyway.
Yeah.
So basically, if it doesn't feel right, that's probably for a good reason.
Okay. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Hi. I'm really impressed by the way you sort of created your next steps. Every time it seems like you went for it and you really got in contact. Do you have anything on your wish list right now after all this you already did?
Of course. I think I like this idea of challenge, and I think about like what if I grow my studio and if I have more people. I look around myself and I see other studios that are bigger than me. So like let's say I look at GTF and I think, how do they manage that? You know, they have, I don't know, 10 people, 12 people, and they still do really good work. But actually there's 3 of them, so that's different. But I think at this moment, on my mind, the challenge is how do I find the balance between my ambitions and my family? So I have a baby on the way, and already have one daughter who's 4.5, and you realize that you know, when I worked at Pheidon, I used to work until 9 every day. Like the cleaner used to come and clean around me. Then the office would close and I had to go home. But you couldn't do that. I couldn't do that now because my daughter is at home, and then I wouldn't see her. So it's challenging to how do you make your time efficient, and how do you achieve what you want to achieve, but you also have a life, and life is not just about work. So yeah, I'm not decided what is the balance, but I want it all, of course. But I don't want to kill myself either.
¿Alguna pregunta más? Thank you very much, Sonya.
Thank you. I made a mess. It was like just